All right, welcome to everybody. My name is Nina Eidsheim. I am professor of musicology at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music and founder and director of the UCLA Practice-Based Experimental Epistemology Research Lab, or PEER Lab. Joining me today is Daniel Walden, assistant professor of music analysis at Durham University. We're both so delighted about each and everyone's presence. Right now, we're sitting in the Herb Alpert School of Music at UCLA, a land-grant university. The Gabrielino Tongva peoples are the traditional land caretakers of Tovaangar, which comprises the Los Angeles Basin and the Channel Islands. We want to take a moment to acknowledge that history of this possession and the fact that it is inextricably linked to the existence of institutions like this one. We invite you to join us in examining the histories of where we're calling in from and to take steps beyond a land acknowledgement by considering the following action plan provided by nativegov.org, which we'll post in the chat now.
Nina and I will not speak very much during the next 2 days. We're mainly here to facilitate the goings-on and to soak up all the insights that will be shared during the presentations, conversations, and the Q&A. But we do want to take a moment at the beginning to explain what led us to organize this event and how it relates to our shared and our individual long-term research projects concerned with the relationship between metaphor, music, and sound.
My investment into uncovering the metaphors we use to understand, practice, sense, and imagine music goes back to wanting to deconstruct the process of racialization through music. From this research process, I've found that the most consequential metaphors have been naturalized for so long that we're not aware of the ways in which they shape our sense of how music goes. And I'm now talking about the kind of logic arising around classical music in Europe and spreading throughout the world through institutions, textbooks, curricula, educators, performance practice, and compositions, and more. These metaphors continue to be absorbed and disseminated by popular discourse and listening culture. Exposing these metaphors and their consequences is important to me because, of course, they not only shape the ways in which we perceive, understand, and assign value to music, but also how we relate to one another and the world. For example, in my book Sensing Sound, I identified and spelled out the ramification of a naturalized metaphor I called the figure of sound. And I'm now taking on other metaphors with Danny and additional collaborators.
My own research focuses on strategies for disentangling music theory and analysis from the legacies of colonialism. And the finding that metaphor plays an essential role in this process was one of the things that brought Nina and myself together as collaborators. We all use metaphors when we talk about music and rarely think very much about it, as when we identify a certain musical gesture as the germ from which the rest of the melody develops, or when producers talk about the stems of an audio mix, just to give a few examples. Sometimes we're entirely unaware that the language we use is metaphorical, as when we talk about musical flourishes. But Nina and I both find that these sorts of metaphors, botanical and otherwise, are working to structure how we think about what music is. Because the metaphors we use to describe the music of our daily lives so often remain concealed, one of the rare moments in which their influence on our thinking becomes visible is when we reach to them to describe what sounds new, or what sounds foreign, or also what causes discomfort. And so to give just one example, consider, for example, the metaphors that 19th century writers deployed when describing the music of cultures other than their own. The first writings about Native American song, for instance, written by settler theorists, were also filled with botanical metaphors, but they were noticeably different from the ones that were often used to describe Western music, as well as the metaphors that Native communities themselves often used. Settler authors, on occasion, likened Native song to delicate blossoms about to be pushed out of the soil by the heartier stalks of Western music. These metaphors shaped how settlers construed what Indigenous song was, as naturally doomed to be replanted, just as cash crops would replace native species on indigenous lands. Now, the flip side of dark stories such as these, however, is that if metaphor is an instrument for shaping music and society, perhaps we can also channel it towards affirmative ends. And so the two of us are hoping that together in this symposium, we can combine critique with creative play, aimed at discovering how metaphor might help us shift the power balance in terms of who gets to name, whose practices are recognized, and what kinds of communities we can create.
And while we've been thinking through these issues, we've been fortunate to do so within the spaces and resources of the Pure Lab. The Pure Lab is dedicated to redefining what is considered good and sound research and methodologies, including listening to and taking seriously modes of knowledge production which has historically been disregarded. The Pure Lab was built on the commitment to developing new sensory knowledge through experimental practices and examining the language and conceptual worlds ingrained in us by the communities we talk with, the literature we read, and the institutions we're part of. Deconstructing metaphors in music is one of the Pure Lab's core projects, and through the organization of this symposium, we extend this conversation to include and learn from all of you. In our planning, we started to envision this symposium anchored by 10 keynotes delivered by, to our mind, the most incisive, curious, and creative thinkers and artists currently addressing metaphor and music. From the very strong response to our call for papers, we built 10 panels around these keynotes and asked valued colleagues to moderate. And we had good help from our program committee, which you can see a list of in our program. All in all, we have 30 presentations, and you can read about each of those presentations, the biographies and the abstracts in the program posted in the link.
So, over the next few days, we'll hear presentations from scholars, from writers, and from musicians on an exceptionally wide variety of topics. We'll learn about the role metaphor plays in giving shape to performance practice, to time, to the voice, identity, narrative, ethnography, environment, sacred life, experience of illness, and much more. And we will understand how metaphors operate in indigenous languages, how they are co-produced with developments in technology, how they structure our conceptual frameworks, our sensorium, our embodied life, and our social communities. And in working through how the study of metaphor might open up new ways of thinking about music, we will draw on decolonial, on anti-ableist, and anti-racist perspectives in imagining what worlds we might be able to use metaphor to create.
And we're also invited for poets to listen in, engage, and reflect back to us aspects of the conversation. They are Tsitsi Jaji, Carlos Piteja, Clara Duplessis, and Jason Camlott from the Spoken Web. So Carlos, Clara, and Jason are from Spoken Web. And I've come to think of them really as our listeners in residence. Welcome to you four. You can find their bio in the program. And also included in the program is a little workbook I've created with my close Pure Lab collaborator, Juliette Belluck, graphic designer and activist. Over the last 2 years, Juliette and I have taught classes and workshops on shifting perspectives and relationships to the things we think we know inside out. And you can see that workbook starting on page 31 in the program, and that also is intended to help us move into that listener in residence mode. We hope you will play with it and share your reflections with us and with each other using the link or email address posted in the chat. And you can, of course, just share things in the chat directly. But we have two places that you can share those reflections as well. Our aspiration for this symposium is also to jumpstart a conversation that will continue to expand and extend long after our final session on Saturday. We're planning an edited volume. Everybody here on the call is invited to submit proposals. And please use the link in the chat if you wish to receive the call for papers.
Great. So finally, before we welcome the first panel, we want to share that in the preparation for this symposium, we have done as much work as we can to promote an accessible, open, honest, and mutually supportive exchange between all symposium participants. And so as we enter the spaces of these panels, we expect nothing but kindness, curiosity, and respect for the different positions we are all bringing to the table, as well as the accommodations we are implementing to ensure everyone is able to participate.
So we can't wait to meet you over the next 2 days. And we wanted to invite you to take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. If you have any particular things in relationship to metaphor that is your interest that you may want to share, that would be lovely to see. And also, I know a lot of people shared in the beginning where they were calling in from, but as you know, you can't see the chat if you enter later. So you're welcome to share that again.